Some of the views expressed on the Mormon Channel are solely for the education and inspiration of our audience and may not represent the official position of the Church.
One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. He ran for president as an independent. He proposed the redemption of slaves by selling public lands and decreasing the size and salary of the United States Congress. He proposed prison reformation, the annexation of Texas, Oregon, and parts of Canada, the securing of international rights on high seas, free trade, and the reestablishment of a national bank. His campaign ended when he was assassinated. We're talking today with historian and BYU professor Arnold Garr about the candidacy of Joseph Smith, Jr. Arnold, welcome to Legacy.
Thank you.
Will you please take a few minutes and introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'm in the Department of Church History and Doctrine at BYU. I've been here for the last 20 years. Going to retire this semester. Prior to that, I was in the church educational system for 20 years in upstate New York, in Tallahassee, Florida, in Boulder, Colorado, and in Utah. So about 21 years in the church educational system and the last 20 years at BYU.
Excellent. I'm looking across the table here, and there's a book sitting in front of you. Tell us about that.
This is a book I wrote 4 years ago entitled Joseph Smith, Presidential Candidate. There'd never been a book written on it, so I thought maybe it's time to do it. There was interest of Mitt Romney, that's his first run for President of the United States, and there was a lot of interest in Mormons running for President of the United States, so I thought it'd be interesting to write a book on his campaign. It's actually a book on all of his political involvements from the time he was a city councilor in Nauvoo, Illinois, then mayor, and then on to when he ran for President of the United States. It was a fun book to write.
So other than the fact that it hadn't been done, why the interest in this?
I've always had an interest in it. I originally started out with be a political science major, and then in order to get a teacher's certificate in Utah, political science wouldn't go for a major, so I changed to a minor, and my major was history. And so my degrees are all in history. My bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degree are all in history, American history. My doctorate degree is in American history. So I have that interest in American history, and I've been teaching church history for years, and so that combination of American history and church history
seemed to mesh.
Yeah, it did.
Excellent. So let's get into this subject. How seriously did Joseph Smith take this run for the presidency of the United States?
That is an interesting question, and I think that's the question I'm asked most. How serious was he? B.H. Roberts always maintained that he didn't think Joseph Smith's run for the president of the United States was very serious. There's a quote where Joseph Smith said, I care more to be a lieutenant general in the Nauvoo Legion than president of the United States, and B.H. Roberts liked that quote. So B.H. Roberts didn't think that Joseph Smith really took the campaign seriously. And I don't know that if he thought he could win, but most third-party candidates, they're trying to gain influence for a cause, and there's no question that he was trying the best he could to get as much influence to help people understand the persecutions that the Mormons had suffered, and to do all he could. And in fact, he states that he wanted to do all he could to help the cause of Mormonism, because they'd lost their property in Missouri and they hadn't received any redress from the states or the national government. So he wanted to do all he could to help the Mormons.
As we've talked about on the show before, his visit to Washington, D.C. for that redress, which didn't amount to anything.
No, it didn't.
So it seems like this was another option that was open to him.
Yeah, he really became disillusioned on that trip to Washington, D.C. That last visit he had with Martin Van Buren. Actually, historians are divided on that. Some people think that he just had one visit with Martin Van Buren. Others think that he had a visit both in November and in February. I'm one of those that believes he had actually two visits with Martin Van Buren. But at any rate, the last visit is when Martin Van Buren made his infamous statement, your cause is just, but I cannot help you. If I help you, I'll lose the vote of the state of Missouri. And that really infuriated Joseph Smith. And that's a turning point in his life, because he came away there with the understanding that the governments were not going to help him. The state government wouldn't help him. The federal government wouldn't help him. So he was going to do all he could now to help the Mormons himself. And he, on the way home, he didn't campaign for anybody, but he campaigned against Martin Van Buren. And he even made that statement that Martin Van Buren would never be elected to public office again. And that came true. Even though he was the sitting president, he never was elected for public office again.
So are we fairly convinced that it was this visit that sent him down a candidacy path?
I don't think he planned on running for president of the United States at that time. He wanted to do all he could to help the Mormons and to empower the Mormons. But that was in 1840, and the run for president didn't happen until 1844. And so I don't think at that time he was planning on running for president. There was no talk about that. In 1843, they had that article in the church periodical asking who would be the next president of the United States, and they didn't advocate anybody, but they wanted to know whoever would run, would they advocate for the Mormons. And when he didn't receive a satisfactory response, well, that's what started it. And then he wrote the letters to who he considered to be the leading candidates, the 5 leading candidates, and when their responses were unsatisfactory to him, that's when he seriously considered running for president of the United States. So I don't think we can say he seriously considered running for president of the United States until late 1843, and well, definitely early 1844, because that's when they announced it.
As I understand it, he and the Quorum of the 12 had purchased Times and Seasons a little before this, and so the announcement or the question of who was going to be the next president, did it come from him?
When his announcement that he was going to run?
Did that question in the Times and Season actually come from Joseph Smith?
I don't know. He's the editor, so I assume that he certainly knew what was going on. So I think you can originate it with him, yes.
So in January 1844, he held a meeting in the mayor's office in Nauvoo with 12 others to discuss the possibility of him running. How much do we know about that meeting?
We don't know a lot. We do know that some people don't realize that the mayor's office was in the red brick store. And so that's where they held it. And there were all the members of the Quorum of 12 were there, and his brother, Hiram Smith, was there. And they discussed the responses of those potential candidates. And he was dissatisfied. He mentioned in that meeting that he was dissatisfied with Martin Van Buren's response. I can do nothing for you. If I do anything for you, I'll lose the vote of the state of Missouri. And Henry Clay's response, he said they should seek redress by moving to Oregon, and that didn't satisfy him. And so then it was Willard Richards that made the move that Joseph Smith run for president of the United States on the independent ticket. At that time, the two political parties were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party, but they chose to run on an independent ticket. The name of his party was Reformed Jeffersonian Democracy Party. Actually, the name was longer than that, but it was so long that that'll probably do.
Tell us about the platform that he was going to run on.
It's an interesting platform. The major plank in his platform is to increase the power of the President of the United States. According to Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, it said that the only way the President of the United States can send troops to suppress a mob in the states is if the governor requests the president to do so. And Joseph Smith wanted to do away with that Article 4, Section 4 of the Doctrine and Covenants. He wanted to give the President of the United States power to suppress mobs in the states. This is before the Civil War, so the states' rights theory is very strong. And that was his major plank, I think, that is to increase the power of the president. John C. Calhoun, when he wrote back and forth with John C. Calhoun said that the president didn't have the right to interfere to suppress mobs in the states because of states' rights. And Joseph Smith wrote back to John C. Calhoun and says, yes, there is precedent for that. George Washington, with the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, he sent troops. And Andrew Jackson, with the rebellion in South Carolina in 1832, he sent troops. So he felt like there was precedent for it, and that was a really important plank. So number one would be, I think if we were prioritizing them, number one would be the power of the presidency. Number two, one of the most intriguing ones, is he wanted to do away with slavery. So this is in 1844, and he proposed to do away with slavery by 1850. And he proposed to buy the freedom of the slaves, to pay the slave owners to free the slaves. And he proposed to do that by raising money by the sale of public lands. And then he also wanted to reduce the number and the pay of congressmen. And from the money derived therefrom, he wanted to use that to free the slaves.
What kind of a comment is that he wanted to use the congressman's salary to?
That's actually his next plank. That kind of is a nice little segue into his next plank, and that's congressional reform. At that time, there were 26 states in the Union. And, of course, there were 2 senators from each state, so there were 52 senators. So he left the senators alone. But there were 223 congressmen. And he wanted to reduce the number of congressmen from 223 actually to 40. He wanted to have 2 congressmen for every 1 million people in the United States. And at that time, there were 20 million people in the United States. So he wanted to reduce the number of congressmen from 223 to 40. And then he also wanted to reduce their salaries. At that time, congressmen were receiving $2 a day for pay. And he wanted to, they were receiving $8 a day for pay. And he wanted to reduce their salaries from $8 a day to $2 a day and not pay them on Sunday. So that was another part of his important plank in his platform to reform Congress. Let's see. Then the fourth, he wanted to have prison reforms. He believed that prisons should be seminaries of learning, and he wanted the prisoners to be involved in public works projects, and he wanted to do away with debtors' prisons. So prison reform was important. He also wanted military reform. He wanted to do away with court-martials for desertion. And then he was in favor of a national bank, which was also a plank for Henry Clay, who ran that year for President of the United States. But he wanted to have a national bank, and then he wanted to have branches in each of the 26 states. And then he wanted to have capital stock to back up all the money that was issued by each of the banks. So he wanted a national bank, and then he was an expansionist. He wanted to invite the Oregon Territory to come into the United States immediately. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about how the Constitution is inspired of God, and he wanted to bring as many people under the influence of the Constitution of the United States as possible. So he wanted to have annex the Oregon Territory immediately. He wanted to annex Texas, if they voted to do so, and have them become part of it. And he even wanted to invite Canada and Mexico to become part of the United States if the citizens so voted. So he was an expansionist. And those are the major planks in his platform.
These don't seem like issues of a guy on the far edge of Western society. It seems they're well informed, and
they are. It's practical solutions to some of the key problems in the United States at that time. His platform was published in a pamphlet called General Smith's Views of the Power and Policy of the President of the United States. And he used the title General Smith rather than President Smith.
Right.
He used a secular title. And the pamphlet doesn't talk anything about his spiritual experiences. It doesn't talk anything about religion. And so it was just kind of practical solutions to some of the pressing problems of the United States. He never claimed to receive revelation on politics, and so he had that plank published in this pamphlet, and they had 1,500 copies issued of the pamphlet, and they sent it to the President of the United States, all of his cabinet members. They sent it to all the senators, United States senators, all the United States congressmen, all the Supreme Court justices. They sent it to postmaster generals and editors of all the major newspapers. And so they had good coverage.
It seems that he's focused well on the needs of the United States. How much of the background of the saints and their sufferings in Missouri affected the platform?
Well, that first plank where he wanted to increase the power of President of the United States, that's
direct.
Yeah, he doesn't talk specifically about a lot of their persecutions, but that's the one plank. That's his most important plank, and that's the one that, the background of that would be the petitions for redress and doing all that he could to get redress for the suffering that the saints endured and the property that they lost in Missouri.
And these issues weren't just his alone. It seems to me that some of them eventually came about.
Yes, just about all of his planks eventually came into being in different forms, not exactly the same, but the slaves were freed. Let's see, maybe could I read one little paragraph
Please.
from this? Some people criticize his method for freeing the slaves as impractical, but I just wrote this. I said, some might criticize this proposal as being economically impractical. Some critics should be reminded that the way the United States ultimately settled the slavery issue was through civil war, a conflict that cost more than $15 billion and more than 600,000 lives. It was the most devastating war in American history, a conflict that left the South in economic ruin and planted bitterness and hatred in the hearts of millions. As historian David Potter once said, slavery was dead, secession was dead, and 600,000 men were dead. In retrospect, it would seem that Joseph Smith's solution to the slavery issue was certainly more sensible than the Civil War.
Wow, that's true.
But the slaves were freed, so that's one of his planks that did come true.
The sea to shining sea, the manifest destiny thing, it seemed like would it have been possible to gain permission from Native Americans? Does that even seem feasible?
Permission for Native Americans to do...
From Native Americans to expand into their territories, etc.
That's interesting. That's the first time I've ever been asked of that. I guess it would be mixed results. I guess in some cases it would be possible. But we know in a lot of cases it wouldn't be possible. Whenever the Anglos came in conflict with the Native Americans, it often ended up in violence. So I think in some cases it's realistic, but probably in a lot of cases not so.
So when did he announce his candidacy and where?
He actually announced his candidacy. They had that meeting in January, and then that very day he started writing the outlines for his platform. And then on February 8th, they publicly read the General Smith's views to the people, and that's really when it was announced, on February 8th. That's when it became public that he was going to run for president.
We're talking today with historian Arnold Garr about the presidency of Joseph Smith Jr. This is Legacy. I'm Nathan Wright, and the next question I wonder about is how did the general membership of the church feel about their president and prophet and mayor and general running for...
I think they were energized. They really were. The church did things a little bit differently then than they do now when it comes to politics. Joseph Smith's campaign was actually, his campaign manager was actually Brigham Young in the Quorum of 12 Apostles. And in General Conference, April General Conference in 1844, Brigham Young and the Quorum of 12, they actually asked for volunteers to serve as electioneer missionaries. That's what they called them, electioneer missionaries. Missionaries to go out and campaign continue to proselyte, but also, while they're proselyting, to campaign for the prophet Joseph Smith. And right there in that meeting on the spot, 244 men volunteered to be electioneer missionaries. And within the next 2 weeks, the number had grown to 337. And just to put that into context, up until that time, the average number of missionaries called to serve in 1 year was 61. And the most missionaries they had ever called to serve in 1 year was 111. And now in one general conference, or within 2 weeks of one general conference, 337 people are out campaigning. You add to that the number of men that were called to traditional missions. They were all men, missionaries were all men in those days. We don't have any sister missionary until 1898, so they're all men that are serving missions. And You add the number of traditional missionaries to these 337 electionary missionaries, and the total number is 586. 586 missionaries, 5 times larger than any missionary force in the history of the church up to that time. And it would be the largest missionary force for the next 50 years.
Wow.
And you see a little burst, you see a little spike in the number of converts because for the year 1844, because when the missionaries would go out, and all the members of the Quorum of 12, except for John Taylor and Willard Richards, went out campaigning for Joseph Smith too. So here's 10 of the 12 out campaigning. Over 300 men are out campaigning, and they're assigned to go to all 26 states in the Union. And they plan for conventions 47 conventions in 15 different states. And so I'd have to say that they were just really enthusiastic. Joseph Smith said, "There's oratory enough in the church to put me in the presidential chair." And so, yeah, they went out campaigning. And it's interesting, they would go out and they would proselyte. You can read in Wilford Woodruff's journal how he did it. They'd go into a little community. They'd arrange to meet in a schoolhouse or a barn or out in the open field somewhere. On Saturday, they'd have a political rally, and on Sunday, they'd have a conference. Or on Sunday, they'd have a conference, then on Monday, they'd have a political rally. And so it was such a unique campaign. There's just never been anything like it. The fact that a candidate would actually call missionaries to go out and campaign for him, it's just, there's never been anything like it ever.
Do we know what effect his electioneers had? I mean, did they gather a lot of interest in the candidacy?
I think we have to say they did. The views, like I mentioned before, there were 26 states in the Union at that time. We have at least 45 newspapers in 22 states, 22 of the 26 states, that published articles about Joseph Smith's candidate for President of the United States, or they just published General Smith's views word for word. But like any other candidate, there were people that were in favor. There were anti-articles, but there were also articles that were in favor of him. Even in New York newspapers and in Washington, D.C. newspapers, there were favorable articles. There were articles against him, but there were also favorable articles. So I maintain that there was more talk of Joseph Smith and more talk of the church in 1844 than any other year up to that time in the history of the church. And like I say, there was a little spike in converts, even though Joseph Smith was assassinated in June of 1844. That last part of the year, there's not a great emphasis on proselyting because the people are gathering back in Nauvoo and the succession crisis. But even though they didn't have what I would say a full year of campaigning, they get a spike in converts. About 4,000 people joined the church that year, whereas the year before only about 1,000 people joined the church. So I maintain that the church and Joseph Smith got more publicity that year than any other year in the first 14 years of the church's history.
And that very well could have been another reason why he did it, publicity.
Yeah, very well.
So he announced his candidacy in April. Is that correct?
He announced it in February.
February. And the following May is when he was officially nominated. Is that correct?
It was in May. Yeah, they had a convention in Illinois. Let's see if I got that date right.
My notes say May 17th.
May 17th is correct,
Which
yeah.
would be
May 17th
this
is
very
correct.
day, however many years ago.
Oh, that's right. I didn't think about that.
160
That's interesting.
some odd years ago.
Yeah, May 17th they actually had a convention in Nauvoo, Illinois, and that's where they officially nominated him as President of the United States, and they nominated Sidney Rigdon as vice presidential running mate.
So who was in attendance at the convention? Just members of the church, or?
Well, it was mostly members of the church. It was in Nauvoo, and they claimed that there were people in the convention from every state in the Union. Of course, we had converts that were migrating to Nauvoo so we did have people from every state in the Union there. But they had other state conventions. They when we get close to the end of our interview here, well, I'll talk about the one in Boston. But like I say, they planned on having 47 different rallies, I guess you could say, in 15 different states over the next year. course, they weren't able to have that many because he was assassinated, but that was the plan. And then they were going to have a national convention in in Baltimore. They were going to have a national convention in Baltimore. They never had it. Didn't get that far. But that was the plan.
And it seems like people were still campaigning even after the assassination because they weren't aware of what had happened.
Yeah, there was no internet. And so they actually had a convention in Boston, and it was on July 1st, and there were at least 6 members of the Quorum of 12 there, including Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. And so they had a state nominating convention for Joseph Smith in Boston on July 1st. And
so 4 days.
Joseph Smith was assassinated on June 27th, 4 days before that. Would that be 4 days? Let's see. Yeah, it'd be 4 days before that. And so they didn't even know that he'd been killed when they had that nominating convention. And it took about two weeks before they actually found out that Joseph Smith had been killed. And then, of course, they hurry back to Nauvoo after that. That ends the campaign for sure.
Getting back to some of the political platforms and attitudes, did his run for presidency have any changing effects on the thinking of the members of the church, like as far as political parties or?
Well, he ran on an independent ticket, and so it wouldn't have. I don't think it would have made any difference on. Members of the church were going to vote for Joseph Smith. So in this specific occasion, they would vote for him. So as far as other than that, I don't think it had any effect on party alignment for the members.
Lasting attitudes, perhaps, about politics, do you think, as far as the membership is concerned?
Well, they definitely were interested in national politics at that time. They really were. I don't think there had never been that much interest in government by members of the church up to that time, more this time than any other time.
He was an independent candidate, as you just said, and he would not have had to attempt or survive a primary election.
That's right.
Do you think he would have had any chances in an overall race?
That's another question I get asked a lot. I really do. Realistically, you have to think probably not. The history of third-party candidates, there's never been a third-party candidate elected for President of the United States. The only person that even came close was Theodore Roosevelt with the Bull Moose Party. But Theodore Roosevelt, prior to that, had been elected President of the United States as a Republican. So he's the only one that even came close to being elected as a third-party candidate for President of the United States. So realistically, I think you'd have to say his chances were pretty remote. But his enemies were afraid. William Law, the Laws, the Higbees, and the Fosters, they actually had a meeting to plot to kill the prophet Joseph Smith. And in that meeting, according to a Brother Southwick, the thing they were concerned about, they really feared that Joseph Smith, if he didn't get elected this in 1844, that he would get elected 4 years from then. And that's one of the reasons they were plotting to kill him. So, there were people that were really concerned about it. But I don't think realistically we can say he thought he could get elected. But those that campaigned for him, I think if you take their words literally, and the Quorum of 12 when they're recruiting, if you take their words literally, they really believed that Joseph Smith could be elected. They really did. I mean, when 500 people go out and 300 of them are going out specifically just to campaign for Joseph Smith, you've got to think that they thought he was going to have a chance to be elected. But I think you can definitely say he was successful in influencing opinion in favor of the church, which is usually what a third-party candidate does. They campaign to try and gain influence for specific causes.
Or for another run sometime.
Yeah, or for another run down the road. That's right.
So the first question I asked today was about his whether he was serious about his run for the presidency, which brings me to the point just before his martyrdom or assassination as a candidate, that he was on his way west when he was called back to answer the charges for treason. And had he abandoned his campaign at that point with his plans of going west?
That's interesting. To say he abandoned it, it's kind of interesting because he never planned to campaign himself personally.
I see.
He said there's oratory enough here in the church to campaign for me, but he specifically said he wasn't going to campaign for himself. So I think it's conceivable, and I'm just thinking out loud here, I think it's conceivable in his mind that he could leave and the campaign could still go on, because the Quorum of 12 was leading the campaign. They were orchestrating the campaign. And he, from the very beginning, he said that he would not campaign for himself. So I think it's possible in his mind he could retreat to the West, and I guess it wouldn't be retreat. He could flee to the West, and still the campaign could go on in his behalf.
Do you have any favorite passages from the book? I mean, you wrote it.
Well, I have a favorite. Let's see, not necessarily from the book, but from an article I wrote years ago. The first article I ever wrote on this, I wrote way back in 1995. And the conclusion I put here was this: the prophet's martyrdom tragically ended his campaign, but not without first winning our admiration. When we consider his campaign, we are reminded of a statement by Edmund Burke: all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. To this, President Ezra Taft Benson said, it is not enough that we wring our hands and moan about conditions of America. We must become anxiously engaged in good causes and leave the world a better place for having lived in it. Joseph Smith literally gave his life to make the world a better place in which to live both spiritually and politically.
And based on his platform, it was John Witzow who said it was an intelligent, comprehensive, forward-looking statement of policies worthy of a trained statesman. So it just seems it was an amazing run from an amazing person. And I wonder what could have been different in history.
Wouldn't have been
something
like
if he
could have lived to see how this all would have played out. Wouldn't that have been interesting? Would have been fascinating.
Any parting thoughts today?
He was always trying to help his people. The reason I wanted to write this book is because Joseph Smith is such a huge spiritual giant. I mean, according to Section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants, he's done more to save Jesus Christ for the salvation of man than anybody. And he's such a huge spiritual giant that sometimes we overlook the fact that he really was a statesman. He was an active, proactive city councilor when the city council was first organized. He was a proactive mayor. He was deeply involved in formulating the Nauvoo Charter, which established Nauvoo as a city officially. And he just did a lot of good in a governmental way as well. And so, yes, he was a tremendous spiritual giant, but I just felt like there was kind of a hole there of all the good he did in a political way. And I hope that the book could help fill that hole a little bit.
Thank you. We have been discussing the candidacy of the prophet Joseph Smith today on Legacy. We're talking with historian Arnold Gara, and we really appreciate you having been with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.